What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2013 Volkswagen Golf TDI Mk6. Today on the TDI behind me, we're going to be covering how to do a timing belt and water pump service. In front of us, we're using a Continental kit, which is available on fcpo.com and will be linked in the description below. With this kit, we have also added a couple pieces of hardware, which will be linked below. Exclusively, we have an engine mount hardware kit, as we will be removing one of the mounts to do this DIY. There are a couple ways to go about this, but for us today, removing the engine mounts is going to be the way. We'll talk about some of the other things that you can do instead as we're doing the job. This is going to be applicable to your 2009 to 2014 TDI engines. You'll find them in the Jetta, the Golf, A3s, all that good stuff. Typically, Volkswagen recommends you do this service between 80 to 100,000 miles. I've seen even up to 108 on some bulletins. The example behind us is at 98,000 miles, so we're going to go ahead and do this job today as preventative maintenance. A couple things you can look out for is typically a good indicator, if you're unsure of when the last time your belt was done, is a leaky water pump. Typically, these will fail first or start to weep first and leak, giving you a good indicator that you should do the belt and pump service. If you can also just pull the timing cover off, inspect the belt, and take a look at it. But about every 100K is a good number for these. In our Continental kit, we have coolant, we have a new serpentine belt, timing belt, cam seal should yours be leaking, a new water pump, and all the idlers and rollers, as well as a tensioner, and a couple pieces of one-time use hardware. Again, we have added a engine mount hardware kit, which we will link below. And if we run across any other hardware or items that you may need during this DIY, we'll also link those in the description below. But before we get started on this job, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. For this job, you will need a torque wrench that can handle anywhere from 10 Newton meters all the way to 120 Newton meters. We have both a 3/8 drive and a 1/2 inch drive for that. Same thing goes for our ratchets. We have both a 1/2 inch and 3/8, but you can use whatever you like, even a 1/4 inch instead of the 3/8, as a lot of the spots are going to be hard to reach. We have a couple extensions. We also have a couple sockets up here. We have a basic socket set, but to be specific, we have a 10, a 13, a 15, a 16, and 18. Important to note, we have a 19 millimeter triple square. That's going to be for our crank bolt. We have a 17 millimeter for our lug bolts. We have an M10 triple square. We have one for our 1/2 inch drive impact, and we have one for our 3/8 drive ratchet as well. We have a T30, a T25, a T20, and a 5 millimeter hex. Some more specialty tools I know is going to be the timing belt, locking tools, or the timing tools for this DIY. We're using CTA 2777, and optional is CTA 2760. That's going to be to turn the tensioner around. You can also sub that out for a 6 millimeter hex key, which is what we're going to show you today. We'll use both, but definitely recommend the locking tool set, as you're going to need to lock the cam sprocket, the injection pump sprocket, and the crank sprocket. So that is definitely a must. Couple things we recommend to have is a paint pen, so you can mark all your hardware once you torque it down. Some medium strength thread locker. We have these Loctite sticks available on the website. We also have some pliers for those constant pressure clamps. A magnet tool is going to be handy for some of the harder to reach hardware. Flathead screwdriver is always handy. I'm going to use a little bit of dielectric grease on the O-ring for my water pump. You can use coolant or something similar, just something that won't degrade the rubber. It'll make installing the coolant pump a lot easier. With that, we have some green Scotch-Brite pad to clean the block up and where the O-ring is going to sit on that. Electric tools make life always a little bit easier. We have our vacuum fill tool, which we're going to be using for our cooling system, but you can opt to just fill it the traditional way. Not pictured here, but needed is going to be a floor jack with either a block of wood or a block of rubber. If not, one of those engine braces that go across the strut tower to support our engine while the engine mounts out. And of course, a catch pan for the coolant. Now we know what we're working with. Let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we are under the hood of the Mk6. Now, it's very important that you do this job with a nice, cool engine. You don't want it to be at temp or hot or anything like that. So if you need to let it sit down overnight, put a fan on it, whatever you need to do to make sure it's cold. First thing we're going to do is drain the coolant system. In order to do that, we're going to go ahead and break the vacuum seal by removing the cap on our expansion tank. And while we're up here, we can also go ahead and remove our insulation cover. These just pop up. And now with that, we're going to hop underneath the Mk6, remove our skid shield, and drain some coolant. To get to our coolant hose, which we're going to be draining from, if your vehicle is still equipped with it, you're going to want to remove your splash shield. It's held in by 9 T25s and 3 T30s along the back. We're going to start with the T25s first, as the shield is kind of held in via the front still, and then we'll tackle the last 3 T30s at the back last. Just be mindful, sometimes there's debris up here, rocks, dirt, fluids, so avoid spilling any of that on your face if you're working on the ground especially. So let's get this off. All right, now that we have our shield off, we have access to some of the coolant lines up front. So let's grab our pliers, remove a clamp, and we'll drain some coolant. All right, so now we're gonna drain from this lower radiator hose here, or this lower coolant line. First, we're gonna loosen it from this plastic clamp here. Small flathead screwdriver will do the trick. It's just an alligator clip. That'll allow us to swing it down once we unclamp it up top. And then we have a hose clamp up top, which we're gonna undo. We can use some pliers. We have our hose clamp pliers handy, so we'll use these to get the clamp off. Now the goal is going to be to break the seal on the hose between the connector here. So if you can, give it a twist and break that seal. Now this won't get all the coolant out. Once we pull the part out, there might still be some more coolant in the system, so make sure you have a catch pan under the car once we get to that point. But for now, this will help get some of the coolant out of the system. All right, and with that, that's all we're gonna get out of here. We can go ahead and reinstall our hose once more, situate the clamp on, and then head it back up top. Once you have your hose situated all the way back up, then you can reinstall your clamp once more. Make sure you leave it in a position where it's easy to access, should you need to get to it again. All right, with that situated, let's head back up top. All right, my good people, back up top, we have a few things to get out of our way before we can even get the timing cover off. Now, this is one of those things where you can choose to do it however you like. A lot of people like to remove some of the things that are bolted down over here and swing them over. Some people like to disconnect all the lines and completely remove them. Totally up to you. We're gonna do a little bit of both. We're gonna unplug a couple electrical connectors, get our auxiliary pump out of here, our expansion tank, and our windshield washer reservoir fill neck. But totally up to you how you want to proceed with this. Some ways are a little bit easier than others. So to get started, I'm going to start by undoing this electrical connector up top here. Is it necessary? Probably not, but it'll just give us a little bit more room to swing this bracket out of the way. These are all your standard VAG connectors, just like the ones on your injectors, ignition coils, on your gas jobs, all that good stuff. Small little tab on the side. It always helps to push the connector in before you pull it out, just like that. I'm gonna use a T30 to undo this one bolt up top of here, swing this bracket off, and put the T30 back in place so we don't lose it. Again, something you could probably just swing out of the way as one, but makes life a little bit easier so we can move everything where we want it. You'll notice a lot of the hardware that we take off has thread locker on it, so just be sure if you see some, make sure you reapply some when you put everything back together. Now with that, we're gonna switch over to our 10mm socket and start with these two 10 mils up here. Then we'll move on to the one on the fuel filter. And if you follow along to where the fill is for the windshield washer reservoir, you'll see one more 10 mil that holds our filter housing in place. We have one more 10 mil at the bottom holding our filter housing in place. And if you need to, you can use a magnet tool to fish it out, or if you can fit your hand, just reach down and grab it. And last but not least, we have a nut that goes on top of the engine mount, holding in the last piece of the puzzle here. Now for this one, I do recommend a magnet tool to fish that nut out. And now with those three, we can work on swinging this oil filter housing up and over. So a couple lines that are attached to everything, kind of keeping everything together. Just pop them out of their spots. There's one more line holding this pump in place that we can get out once we get our expansion tank out of the way. So with that, same style connector on the expansion tank, tap up top, push in, and then out. And then we have two T25s on the back side here underneath this loom that hold our tank in place. And be sure to put your cap back on if you're gonna swing this unit over, or if you remove it, that way any residual inside the tank doesn't just spill everywhere. With our tank undone, we have some more wiggle room now to pop this last line out of the plastic clip that holds it in place. These can be a little tricky to get out if they've never been out before, and that should give us some room to swing this oil filter housing over to the side. And now we have some room to get to the 10 millimeter so that we can remove this neck portion of the fill tube here for the windshield washer fluid. And you can go ahead and feed your 10 mil back in here. And now with that, we have a little bit more access to the triple squares that hold this whole assembly in place, which we're also going to get out of our way. And this also gives us room to this lower clamp that goes on our expansion tank, should you want to separate it. But once you get these two triple squares out of the way, then everything will swing over freely. So with that, let's grab our triple square and get that off. A small flathead screwdriver will allow you to pop this tab up that holds some of our lines in place. This may be a little bit tricky depending on how long they've been on here or if it's ever been apart before or not. I literally popped it off a second ago. And now with that, we have access to the two M10 triple squares that hold our bracket in place. And now that will free up our pump. Just note there is one electrical connector still remaining on this auxiliary pump right here. We can go ahead and disconnect that as well. All right, and with that, we have access to our upper timing cover. It's totally dealer's choice if you choose to disconnect the lines from here or not. You can work around them. Bungee cord will help that from falling on top of you. But for now, we're going to keep everything as is, and we're going to work on taking our timing cover off. We have two latches right up top here that are easy to see. This one isn't even doing anything. And then we have a third one down below here on the cam side of things. Beautiful. And now with that off, my good people, we have a good view of our timing belt, our injection pump, pulley or sprocket, our cam sprocket, all that good stuff. Before we go any further, we're going to hop into the passenger side wheel well and work on getting the rest of our cover off before we take the motor mount off. And while we're under there, we're going to show you where we're going to brace the motor from. Now here's where this job can go a couple different ways depending on how you want to tackle it. You can do this DIY without pulling the engine mounts. That would require you to undo the locking nut on the tensioner and pulling the stud out with the tensioner. Yeah, you might save a little bit of time, but if you're just doing this at home, I would argue that taking the engine mounts is a lot easier. You have a lot more room to work with. And yeah, sure, it takes a couple extra steps, but makes life a little bit easier. But for those of you that don't want to do that, or maybe you're doing this on a timely budget, taking that locking nut off and then removing the stud with some pliers will grant you access to getting that off and allowing you to slip the new belt in and out. But with that, let's hop under the car, get in our passenger side wheel well, and show you the next steps. All right, next step is going to be to work on removing the passenger wheel well. If you still have your beauty covers, a small pick or the factory tool will work to get these off, which we still happen to have. Don't forget to have your wheel lock handy if your car's still equipped with the lock, the factory lock. And then we have 5 17 millimeter lug bolts to remove. Now we have the wheel off, we can work on removing the fender liner. It's totally up to you if you just want to remove the lower portion or if you want to remove the whole thing. Personally, I think this is a great time to inspect the notorious rockers. Usually these are very notorious for trapping in a bunch of dirt and moisture, causing the rockers to rot out and the fender. So we're going to do our friend Pat a favor and pull the whole thing off just to make sure there's not a lot of crud back here. But otherwise, you could argue that just the bottom half is the move. So we have a bunch of T25s. Let's get to it. We have 2 T20s at the bottom of the mud flap, and then the rest are T25s. Now we can pull this bottom liner out. Gives us a clear view of our crank pulley. And then again, we're just pulling the rest of this off to do an inspection and clean up if need be. Just one plastic clip here that you need to remove as well. Just using a flathead screwdriver to pull it out. Any bets on the amount of debris that's going to be behind here? Place your bets now. Leave them in the comment section below. Ready for this goodness? It's going to be real good back here. Look at that. Here's your culprit. This is what we're trying to avoid having buildup over time. This will cause a lot of rust and corrosion. These foam pieces, while they're really great at keeping the road noise down, they're also really good at trapping moisture. Look at that. I'm gonna give Pat the option on whether or not he wants to keep it. It's gonna rip it down from now. It does go all the way up. These deteriorate pretty easily, but you can see how much fluid we just squeezed out of it. We'll clean this all up for him and then give him the choice whether or not he wants to put this back. I would sacrifice a little bit of noise over having my car rot out, but that's just me. So let me know in the comments what you do, my good people. Do you keep the foam piece? Do you dry it out and put it back in? For now, we'll clean that up 2 seconds, but let's pick it back up with removing our serpentine belt and our crank cover. 16mm wrench or socket on the tensioner is what you're gonna need to get that slack loosened up. I'm gonna use a socket with a ratchet here. So turning it left is gonna loosen up the belt, which then you can go ahead and pull off, starting by the AC compressor. And we can pull the belt off the rest of the way. And since we have a new one and this is original, we're gonna go ahead and replace it anyways. Moving on, we're gonna work on removing the crank pulley. It's held in by 4 M10 bolts. You can use a 19mm 12-point to counterhold. However, if you have an electric impact gun, I highly suggest using that. Makes removal of these a lot easier. Don't worry about which way it goes on. There is a locating dowel right here in the middle, so it only goes on one way. So we're gonna use the Milwaukee to zap it out. Then we'll set that to the side. This hardware is one-time use. We have those linked in the description below for you as well. Most important, whenever you remove triple squares, make sure that the bit is fully situated. The last thing you want to do is strip them out. Then they can be a real pain in the butt to remove. And now we can pull the pulley off. Now we're going to work on removing the 5 10mm bolts that hold our lower timing cover in place. Notice these two have a little bit of Loctite on the threads, so we'll make sure to reapply some when we reinstall them. And now we should be able to pull the cover off and just clean it up, set it to the side, and now we have a nice open view of our timing belt. So in this toolkit, we have 2 locking crank sprocket tools. I went ahead and marked the arrows that you need to pay attention to with a little bit of blue painter's tape. It's a little bit hard to see, but once you mark them, I suggest you mark them with a paint pen. It makes life a little bit easier. For our vehicle, we're gonna be using the black locking tool here, or the rounded sprocket, if you will. Now, the goal here is gonna be to turn the crank sprocket with either a triple square or a 12-point socket. We're gonna use a 12-point 19mm socket today, but you can also use an M14 triple square in the center. Now, we're gonna line up the crank sprocket with our little locating tab, which we're gonna mark with a pen as well, in a 12 o'clock position for this style locking tool. If you have the oval shaped one, then you're gonna wanna rotate it to about the 1 o'clock position to match the arrow on that silver locking tool. So it's only gonna fit one of them, you can't mix them up. And then another thing you have to pay attention to up top, which we'll show you in just a moment, is to make sure we're in top dead center on the right stroke. There's a little crown shaped cutout on the top cam sprocket, which has to point in the 12 o'clock position roughly versus the 6 o'clock. So we'll show you that. But for now, let's go ahead and set it down below. Then we'll hop up top and check our timing marks up top. If they are 180 degrees off, then we'll spin the crank one more time and line them up. So let's get our tools situated first. Over on the crank sprocket, here is the locating arrow or tab we're looking for. We just marked it in some blue. And now using a 19mm socket on our ratchet, we're gonna line this up to roughly the 12 o'clock position, right where that dowel is up top. That's where our tool locks into. And then we can adjust as needed. So we're a little bit off. Now we can just go back and forth until we set it right. There we go. And with our tool in place, you can see both of the blue marks lined up. The tool does sit a little bit awkward past the line up here, so don't worry about that. Now we have the lower crank sprocket locked. We're gonna hop up top and verify that we're in the right compression stroke. and then we can work on with the rest of the DIY. But one thing we wanted to mention before we get up there is two things. One, there is a plug in the wheel well here that you're going to want to remove. That's going to give you access to one of the 3 bolts that hold the engine mount to the block. Secondly, we're going to be using a floor jack with a piece of wood to support the engine from underneath here on the oil pan. So make sure you have something soft, either a piece of rubber or a block of wood, so you don't damage the oil pan and you don't risk putting your floor jack through it. You can also use an engine brace that goes across the strut towers. That kind of gets in the way though when you're doing this DIY, so a floor jack is going to be our friend. Again, that's going to be once we work on removing the engine mount. But for now, let's head up top, make sure we're in the correct timing, and go from there. So taking a look at our cam sprocket up here, this is the what I call a crown shape opening in the sprocket. This needs to be roughly at the 12 o'clock position to show that we're in the correct top dead center compression stroke. We don't want it on the exhaust stroke. So I'm going to hop underneath, rotate the crank one more time. This will come out another 180 degrees, and then we can lock it back up, and then we can work on locking the sprockets up here as well. So with that, let's go ahead and set our timing properly now that we know how to lock the crank. You always want to rotate the engine in the direction that it's turning while running. In this case, it would be clockwise. It's normal to feel a little bit of resistance. That's just the compression. So now that we have our timing properly situated up here, we can either go ahead and pin the sprockets now. It really doesn't matter. We can go ahead and do that once we're ready to take the belt off. For now, let's work on removing our engine mount next. So we'll get our floor jack situated with a piece of wood, and then we'll work on taking those out. So first we're going to work on removing the 2 13mm bolts that go from the body to the engine mount. Using a 13, we're just going to zap them out. These are getting replaced with our engine mount hardware kit, and we'll take this bracket off and set it to the side. Then we have 2 16mm bolts for the engine mount to the body of the car. Same thing, those are going to be replaced. And if it wasn't clear by now, this is the point in time where you want to have your engine supported either down below with a floor jack and block of wood, or across the top with an engine brace. Then we have 2 18mm bolts that join the bracket to the engine mount. All right, and now we can pull this mount off. And now with that, we can work on getting this bracket off. For the upper bolt right here, you can raise up the engine a bit to give you easier access to that bolt. For that, we're going to use a 16mm socket. You can also use a wrench. These 3 bolts that hold the bracket onto the block are reusable. They're not torque to yield. Some people do replace them. If this is your second or third time doing this job, maybe not a bad time to replace them, but this is the first time these come off. So we'll go ahead and use them for this time being. All the other ones though will be replaced as they are part of our kit. The second bolt, we're going to get through the access plug in the wheel well. So let's get down and cozy and get that one out. Cool. I'm using a 16 on a swivel socket here to get the second bolt through our access plug. There we go. Super long on that second one. And now we have one more down at the bottom, which we're going to lower the engine down for just a little bit, and we'll get that third one. And then we have one more 16 at the bottom. I lowered the engine down a bit with our floor jack. And I'm just going to break this free by hand, and then we'll get it off. You could probably get a socket on here, but I'm already on the ground with the wrench. It'll come out just as easy. And straight at the bottom we go. All right, my good people, at this point we have our engine mount and bracket out of the way. I went down there with my 19mm triple square, and I just went ahead and pulled out the bottom locking tool. Now we know that we're at the correct top dead center and our tool locked in. That's great. We're going to go ahead and pull that off for now. We're going to visit that at the end. Now our goal is to lock the cam and the high injection pump. So for that, we're going to have to rotate the crank just a hair until we line up the opening on our cam sprocket with the opening on the block so that we can feed our locking tool in. Now everything's still under tension. We haven't removed anything other than our bottom locking tool. So we're going to go ahead and rotate with our 19mm 12 point back and forth until we can get the hole lined up for our tool to go in. That's going to be right here on this slot. We should see that opening on the back. It should be right about there. There we go. Our tool should sit in all the way, nice and flush. Now we have our cam position locked. We're going to go ahead and loosen the 3 13mm bolts. That way our sprocket can rotate left and right. They are slotted a bit. And then from there, we're going to move over to the next sprocket. So let's do that now. With our sprocket locked in on our cam gear, we're going to go ahead and break these 3 13mm bolts loose, just about a quarter turn or so, just enough to allow them to spin freely. All right, beautiful. And similar to how we did with the cam sprocket, we're going to rotate the crank a bit until we line up the inner tab on the injection pump, or the high injection pump, fuel pump, call it what you will. We're going to go ahead and lock the back tab with the hole in the block so that we can put in our lock pin. You should see that line up there. The tool pretty much goes over the sprocket itself. It doesn't key into the tool, into the dowels or anything like that, into the dips. This one's a little bit of a tight fit. Let's make sure you line up your tab properly. All right, now that we have our sprocket locked, we're going to loosen the 3 bolts just like we did on the cam sprocket. We're not removing them, we're just loosening them so that this can rotate back and forth on the slots using an M10 triple square bit. Wonderful. Now that those are loose, we can work on loosening up the 15mm nut that locks down our tensioner so that we can get our belt off. And again, just to reiterate, at this point, we haven't reinstalled the bottom locking tool yet. That was just when we had the car up in the air to show you what that looked like. It's a little bit tight once the car's back on the ground. But that'll come back into play when we go to time everything up. So for now, 15mm nut, you can use a wrench, you can use a socket, get that locking nut off. At this point, you can either use the tensioner tool, which looks like this if you got one. You can use a 6mm hex instead, or you can just rotate it by hand to get rid of the tension on the belt. That's exactly what we're looking for. And now it's just going to be a matter of working the belt off. I like to start by the large idler, and that gives us plenty of slack. All right, my good people, and here is our good old trusty belt. It almost made it to its 100,000 mileth birthday. Obviously, it still looks like it's in okay shape, but it's almost 10 years old. If you start flexing it, there's a little bit of cracking on the outside skin, and I'm sure if we left it on for just a little bit longer, it would start to crack on the inside. So we're gonna go ahead and continue on with this removal. At this point, again, I mentioned there's a couple ways to go about this. It's totally dealer's choice if you wanna work on locking the crank sprocket down now, or if you wanna lock it down when you go to install your new belt. Now we have our timing belt off, we can work on removing the idlers, the rollers, and the water pump. Same thing goes for the belt tensioner. Personally, I like to do one at a time. I like to pull the old part off, install the new one, so on and so forth. They're all different sizes, but personally, that's just how it works in my brain. So we'll start with the top roller, 13mm socket. We're just gonna zap it off with the electric ratchet for now. All right, we have our old roller here. We have our new one. The new one already comes with a new piece of hardware. Now, this is more dealer's choice than anything because this is a diesel and it is rattle central. For something delicate like this, I like to add just a little bit of medium strength thread locker to it. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. Just a little baby dab. We want it to be able to come out in the next 100,000 miles or so when this gets serviced again. But this will also give us a little bit of peace of mind. And by us, I mean that it will not be shaking out on our good old friend Pat anytime soon. I'm just gonna snug it up gently and then we're gonna torque it down. All right, we're gonna set our torque wrench to 20 Newton meters and torque this 13mm bolt down. There we go, not a whole lot. And we're gonna hit it with a paint pen just so that we know we have already torqued it down. Moving on, we have our idler pulley down below. That one's held in by a 16mm bolt. And our kit includes a new bolt for this pulley as well. And same deal, just a little dab of medium strength thread locker on it. Now we're going to torque this 16 millimeter bolt down to 50 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees or a quarter turn. There's our 50. What I'm going to do, just to keep life super simple, is mark my bolt. I'm going to use this corner, which is at our 12 o'clock position, and we're going to bring it over to 3 o'clock. Moving on next, we have our water pump. So we'll go ahead and get that one off. It's held in by 3 10 millimeter bolts. All right, now we have the 3 10 millimeter bolts off. The next move is going to be to pull our water pump off. Let's give it a couple wiggles. We got to break the seal between the pump, the O-ring, and the block. Make sure you have your catch pan down below situated, ready to rock and roll. This pump was still in a really nice shape, nice and tight. Wasn't making any funny noises. As far as Pat knows, this has never been replaced before. And as far as we can tell, it's genuine original. But I digress. Now we're going to take a little bit of Scotch-Brite. We're just going to clean the opening of the housing where this seals up. We'll clean it up nicely and we'll grab our new pump and work on reinstalling it right away. All right, my good people, we have our new pump ready to rock and roll. You want to lubricate the seal with either some coolant or some sort of grease that isn't going to degrade the seal. Make sure you keep it just to the seal. You don't want to contaminate the water in the cooling system as well. So we're going to go ahead and install our pump. The reason you want to coat everything is so that the seal doesn't get pinched, A, causing leak, and B, a headache. So give it a couple twists while we feed it in. There we go. I'm going to feel it set itself back in. What I'm doing here is just pushing a bit on the impeller with one hand and rotating the pump with my left hand off that stud. And now it's just a matter of making sure the bolt holes are lined up. And now we'll get the 3 10 millimeter bolts started by hand. And same deal, my good people, just the tiniest dab of some medium strength thread locker to keep a little bit of peace of mind and make sure that these will stay in here. Now we're going to go ahead and torque all 3 of the 10 millimeter bolts down to 15 Newton meters. So we'll set the 15 on our torque wrench and snug those babies up. Now we have our last 10 millimeter bolt down below. Beautiful. And even though no one will ever see this until this job is done again, we'll hit them with a little paint pen for our own peace of mind so that we know we torque them down. You and I, my good people. You take this tested sticker off. With my luck, it'll come off and jam something up and destroy this whole car. Now we have our last roller to remove at the bottom, held in by a 13 millimeter nut. We can go ahead and pull the old spinny boy off. Oh, much more tighter. No noise, ready to rock. Feed in the new roller down at the bottom. We have our 13 millimeter nut. And we're going to torque this one down to 20 Newton meters. And second to last, we have our tensioner, which now we can fully remove the rest of the way. We already loosened up the 15 millimeter nut. Pull that bad boy out. A couple things we want to talk about on the tensioner while we have it up here in the open. There's a tab on the back here that's going to key into the block or the inner timing cover, which we'll show you in just a moment. Once we have the belt on and everything situated and we're ready to snug it up, this small silver tab right here, which I'm going to color in just to give you a better view. This will also help us when we're working. We're going to rotate this again, either using the tensioner tool or a 6 millimeter bit. And we're going to want this, well, it's not going to rotate now because it's not in the car, but this will line up and this silver, or now blue little arrow, is going to situate itself between the opening here on the back tab. Volkswagen allows for 1 or 2 millimeters of play either way when you install this, so don't worry about it being exactly in the middle. Once it's operating, it will move around a little bit. Now we can feed our tensioner in. Again, being mindful of that tab in the block, or the timing cover, if you will. Our new locking nut is a 13 millimeter. Size changes a little bit, but we're gonna want a new one as this is a torque to yield fastener. Now that we have our tensioner on, the locking nut is still loose, so we can move everything around. The next step is gonna be to lock our crank sprocket, and then we're gonna rotate the injection pump and the cam sprocket a bit before we feed our belt on. So let's do that now. All right, right now, all we're gonna do is put our locking tool back on the crank sprocket. We're gonna line it up nicely. Get our tool on, just like we covered earlier. So now we have our crank locked. We're gonna make sure that our cam sprocket and our injection pump sprocket are fully clocked all the way to the right, like that. Same thing over here. And now we're gonna feed our belt on, starting at the crank first, and then we'll work it all the way around. You wanna make sure you're taking up the slack as you're feeding it around the crank pulley. We'll pull the belt up here over the tensioner. So at this point, my good people, because we're dealing with a new belt, it is extremely tight, just generally a pain in the butt getting the new belt on, especially with the tensioner and the rollers and all that good stuff in place. So what I would suggest is taking off one of the rollers. So we're gonna take off the lower one just to give us a little bit of slack in the belt so that we can get it on. Then we can get the roller back on afterwards. I'm gonna try removing the lower roller first, and then we'll get our belt on. Again, making sure that our cam sprocket and our injection pump sprocket, at the end of all this, we want them to be centered on the oval slots that each one of them have. So depending on which way you're installing the belt, you're gonna wanna clock them either to the right, clockwise, or to the left, counterclockwise. So for now, we're still gonna stick from feeding it from the left side, if you will, or the cam side of things, and working our way around. But for now, let's take off the lower roller. All right, we have our roller off. I'm just gonna pull the belt off one more time. Make sure our sprockets are clocked where we want them to be. The goal here is that when we tension everything, this will come like that, and the injection pump will come like that. And we'll take the slack up from the crank side of things since that is not spinning. And we're gonna feed our belt over our cam sprocket. And with that, we'll feed it under our roller, over our injection pump. Again, being mindful of how that is keyed currently. Now I'm just pushing the belt on fully over the roller here, the water pump, the injection pump sprocket. And now what we're looking for is when we put some tension on the belt down here for these two cam sprocket and injection pump sprocket to kind of center themselves out a bit. If not, we'll have to take the belt off and reposition. So as you can see, we're still way too far right on both sprockets. So now we know that we can get the belt on like this, and we'll be able to get our idler on down below. I'm gonna go ahead and pop the belt off one more time, clock these sprockets over just a little bit more, one more tooth. Then we'll try this again. Another thing we did here was lock the tensioner over using a 5mm hex and a 6mm hex to swing it fully over, and then just snugging it down with the 13 or 15, depending on what nut you're using, just to give us a little bit more slack. And now we can reposition our sprockets. All right, that's much better. We have our belt on. Once we put a little bit of tension on it, both of these sprockets are centered pretty close. So now we're gonna put our bottom roller back on. We'll put our 13mm nut back on. Just gonna snug it up very gently with the impact, and then we'll torque it down once more. There we go. All right, now that we have that situated, we can go ahead and loosen up this 13 on our tensioner once more, so we can get that 5 mil out of place. And we can pull that out. And now we're gonna go ahead and line up the tab here that we showed you earlier that we painted blue with the tab on the back. We want them to be centered. Again, everything is still locked into place. And you can use a 6mm hex like we're doing right now, or you can use the CTA tensioner tool to bring it over, whichever you prefer. I'm gonna stick with the 6mm for now. And so now we're gonna lock our tensioner. We're gonna set it in place. Again, lining up the small triangle in between the opening on the back tab. You can see we painted those blue so you can see those a little bit easier. Then we're gonna lock it down to 20 Newton meters plus a quarter turn, or less than a quarter turn, about 45 degrees. So just 1/8 of a turn. So that's our 20 there. And I'll make a small mark on my nut. And then we'll just rotate it over about 1/8 of a turn. Now we have this situated, we can go ahead and pull our tool out. We'll throw a mark on our tensioner here so that we remember that we've torqued it down. So at this point, my good people, just to recap, we have our belt on, everything's still locked up. We still have our pins in. We have our injection pump, crank sprocket in a good spot, nice and centered. We have our cam sprocket in a good spot, nice and centered on the bolts. And we have all our idlers and rollers in, everything's nice and torqued down. At this point, what we're gonna go ahead and do is pull our locking pins out, pull our crank lock out. We're gonna rotate the whole assembly twice at the crankshaft, so we do a full rotation up top here. And we can do that once or twice, and what we're looking for is, A, we don't want anything to bind up. If it gets really tough, and I'm talking tougher than just the compression stroke, then something's off, something's wrong. And our goal is to be able to spin everything and then be able to lock everything back up once we've done a couple turns. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that we have set our timing, we've locked down our tensioner nut. The next step is gonna be to lock down the 13mm bolts and the M10 bolts on both of our sprockets. Both of these get torqued down to 20 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees or a quarter turn. What we're gonna do first is we're just gonna tighten them down both to 20. And then from there, we're gonna check our timing. We'll make sure that our pin goes back into our cam sprocket. It's okay if there's a little bit of play, or if the injection pump is just a hair off. Based on how it operates, it's not gonna hurt anything. But our goal is to be able to insert that cam pin and our crank locking tool once more. Once those are good to rock, then we can do the additional quarter turn and paint mark both the 13mm bolts and the M10 bolts. So for now, 20 Newton meters on both sets, and then we'll pull the tools off and check our timing. I'm gonna snug these up by hand. And we'll switch to the M10 bit. All right, we have our sprockets locked up. Now we're gonna go ahead and pull our locking tools off. It's gonna be a little bit tight, that's okay. Now we can pull our bottom locking tool off, and we'll take our 19mm on our ratchet, and we'll do a full engine rotation, which will be 2 full rotations down at the crank, so that this sprocket ends up back in TDC. And then we'll make sure we'll check our locking tool and alignment tool, and if we have to adjust, we will adjust after the fact. So remember, you're feeling for any weird binding. It's normal to feel the normal compression from the engine. So if you feel that, no problem there. If you feel anything more than that, then you want to stop, back up, and check everything. That's 1 full rotation at the crank. All right, now we're getting close to TDC. We're going to want to lock our cam. Now with our cam locked in, we're gonna make sure that our crank tool goes back on. We have our locking tool on our crank on, our pin is in, so that's good. That's exactly what we want. As far as the injection pump is concerned, We don't have to lock that one back up, but as long as it's close, even if it's off by just a hair, then that's totally okay, just based on how the pump works. And now from there, we can work on pulling our locking pin back out and start reassembling some of the good stuff. So we'll start with our lower timing cover and go from there. All right, at this point, we know that our timing's good, our pins went back in. I went ahead and just reinstalled the pin on the injection pump once more. I've marked my 3 M10 bolts to give them the final 90 degrees. So we're just gonna give them a quarter turn so we can finalize these up. And then we'll paint mark them all the way, just so that we know we have done our duty here, and we torque them up. Now over on the cam sprocket, we have to give those an additional 45 degrees or an 1/8 of a turn. So same deal. We'll give them a little mark, and then we'll give them an 1/8 of a turn. And then we'll mark those down as well. And now with that, we can pull all our locking pins out. We'll pull our crank locking out, or our crank locking tool out. And we can pick it back up with reinstalling our lower timing cover and our crank pulley. And then we'll work our way up to our engine mount and all that good stuff. So let's get to it. So now we're gonna work on installing our engine mount. Now the second bolt, the one that we access through the opening on the wheel well, I like to leave this one in when I feed the mounts up. You're gonna have to jostle it back and forth so that you can clear the block as you're pulling it up, but it makes life a little bit easier, so you don't have to worry about feeding it through both the opening and it's at a bit of an angle. So we're gonna leave that one in. We're gonna reach from underneath, feed the mount up, grab it up top, and then we'll start with our first bolt. We'll just get all of these hands started first, and then we'll torque them up. So let's feed the mount up. I'll leave this bolt up here, ready to rock and roll. We went ahead and lowered the block just a little bit with our floor jack so we can access the bottom hole a little bit easier. I'm gonna feed that in, get that started by hand. All right, let's just finger tight. Now we can get our torque wrench situated and snug all of them up. All right, so we have all 3 bolts started by hand for our mount. There is a sequence to tightening them. There's an order, I should say. First one's gonna be the one through the access hole in the wheel well. The second one's gonna be the most bottom bolt, and then the last one will be the third bolt, which is the easy one to reach up top here. Use your floor jack to raise and lower as need be to access all 3. Right now I have it raised a little bit so I can access the one through the access hole first. We're gonna torque all 3 of these down to 45 Newton meters. So we'll snug them up with the ratchet, and then we'll torque them down. All right, now let's move to the lower one. All right, we've lowered our engine down a bit to get to the bottom bolt. Beautiful. Now we're gonna jack it up a bit and we'll get to the top third bolt. Now we're gonna go ahead and jack up the block a little bit with our floor jack so we can access this last bolt and torque it down. Torque this one to the 45 Newton meters. Beautiful. Now we have all 3 of our bolts securing our bracket to our block. The next step is going to be to bring our engine mount over with our new hardware. We'll level this out a bit. We'll join the 2 here at the bracket first, and then we'll snug up the rest. We're still going to be using the floor jack to help us align all the hardware, get it started by hand, and then once everything's nice and flush, we can lose the floor jack. And then from there, we'll install our covers, our crank, and all that good stuff. So let's do that next. Now we have our mount situated, we can go ahead and, or our bracket situated, we can go ahead and install our engine mount. And again, we're gonna be using the engine mount hardware kit, which is linked below. We're gonna start by setting our mount in place, and we will join these 2 pieces together loosely. Then from there, we're gonna lower the block down a little bit. Our jack is still in place, and we'll get the other 2 bolts started by hand. And then once everything's starting nicely, we'll snug these up a bit. Then we'll lower the engine down and we'll snug down the other ones. We're gonna start with the 2 18mm bolts. If you do wanna replace these bolts, again, they are torque to yield hardware. I really recommend you only use them the one time. So if you're doing this job for the first time, make sure you get the kit. Unless you're doing the job without taking the mount off, then props to you. You can skip this part right here. Now, these are still gonna be loose. We're gonna just slowly lower the engine down a bit until our holes line up down below for the mount to the body of the car. So let me lower this just a little bit, and then we'll pick it back up with starting our 16mm bolts. So at this point, our mount is still loose. It can still move around. We haven't bottomed it out, but our holes are lining up for the threaded ends on the body of the car. So we're just gonna start these gently by hand. These are the 16mm bolts. All right, at this point, we have more than enough threads on the mount to body hardware. So what we're gonna do here is just snug them up a little bit more. Again, we're still not fully flush with the block or with the body of the car. We're also gonna snug up these 18s just a little bit more. I'm gonna try to match the marks on the bracket so that the hardware sits in the same spot so that our motor is nice and lined up. And then once everything's a little bit more tight, then we'll go ahead and drop the floor jack completely, putting all the weight on these, and we'll torque them up. So now we have our two 18s snugged up. That's gonna be the mount to the mounting bracket. We still have our two 16s, which are most of the way threaded in, but our floor jack is still suspending the block. So now we're gonna lose the floor jack, we'll fully drop it down, and then we can torque both of the 16s and both of the 18s. So I'm just gonna snug up the two 16s with the electric ratchet. Now we're gonna snug the two 16s down to 40 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. And then we'll just make a mark with our paint pen. This will make it easy for us to just see that we did a quarter turn. That's really all we're looking for here. If you have a torque wrench with angle mode, now would be the time to use that. There's two. And we'll just hit them with a little paint pen to show that they've been torqued down, and we'll match them up to the mount itself. Now we can switch over to the two 18s. The 18s get torqued down to 60 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So we'll go ahead and torque these down. There's two. We'll make our marks. And then we'll rotate them another 90 degrees or a quarter turn. There's two. And we'll mark these up. Now with these four bolts situated, we will leave the mount to body bracket off until the end. We're going to put our expansion tank in first, so that'll give us some room to work with. For now, we're going to lift up the car. We're going to hop into the wheel well, put our timing covers on, we'll put our pulley back on, and we'll go from there. All right, my good people, we're going to install the lower timing cover now. This is a two-piece cover. Yours may have come apart when you took it out, but the top portion of the lower cover sits on top of the bottom portion, so just make sure you line those up properly. There's a small arrow here that points to a small notch on the cover. Just make sure those are lined up. We have 5 10mm bolts. If you remember, when we took this apart, all of that hardware had a little bit of Loctite on the threads. So we just wire wheeled them. We cleaned them up quickly, took the old Loctite off of them, and we're gonna apply just a small dab of medium strength to them when we put them back, just mainly trying to keep the vibrations from backing them out. So we're gonna feed these up. Might be a little bit tricky to do them as one, so you can feed them in as two pieces. The goal here is to get this cover in the right spot. You don't want it to interfere with the belt. And then this top portion gets sealed off with the upper cover. So let's reach up, feed these in. We might have to do them in two spots or in two pieces. So roughly our upper cover is gonna sit something like that. We're gonna feed our bottom one in. Just make sure it keys underneath the upper. And now we can grab our 10mm bolts. And I'm just gonna put them in by hand, one by one, put a little bit of Loctite on them, and then we're gonna snug them up with the electric ratchet. The torque spec for them is 10 Newton meters if you wanna torque them up. We're gonna do the middle ones here and join the two covers together so they don't fall down. And we have the last one up top. There's a small divot in the cover for this one to go into. Sorry for my hand. There's a better look at the 510s. So again, we're just gonna snug them up with the ratchet, but should you wanna torque them down, 10 Newton meters is gonna be your friend. Now we can install our lower crank pulley. If you remember, there's a dowel on the sprocket. So that means that the pulley can only go on one way. These bottom crank bolts get torqued down to 10 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. They are one-time use since they are torqued to yield. So make sure you replace them. These are also linked in the description below. We're gonna go ahead and apply, again, same thing, just a small dab of medium strength thread locker to these, just to keep them from rattling out. Definitely is not gonna hurt, and it will allow them to come out next time this car is serviced. We're just gonna snug these up with the electric ratchet, try to bottom them out if we can, and then we're gonna use our 19mm 12 point to counter hold them. All right, that's just nice and snug. Now we'll set our torque wrench to 10 Newton meters. First, we can see if we can even torque them down without holding the crank. I don't think it's possible, but we'll give it a shot. And 4. So we got them pretty close using the electric ratchet. 10 Newton meters is not a whole lot, so it's not surprising that we were able to get them, even though I just said it was a maybe. But for the 90-degree turn or the quarter turn, we will certainly have to counter hold. So we'll use our 19 mil, 12 point, and we'll just do one at a time. Now we're going to reinstall our serpentine belt. Our timing belt kit comes with a new Continental belt, so we're going to go ahead and replace it. The original one did have 100,000 miles on it, so it is certainly due for a replacement. We're going to start by feeding the belt over our alternator pulley up top, something like that. And we're going to want to feed it over the crank pulley. So we have it pretty close. Now we're going to need to take some tension off of our tensioner using a 16mm wrench or socket on your ratchet. We're going to put the tool on here, and we're going to turn it to the left until we have enough slack to feed our belt over our crank pulley. And now that we can make sure that our belt is on the grooves properly, it's not off to the side, we can release the tensioner. And now our belt is back on. Some vehicles have an OEM or genuine cover that goes over the crank pulley. If you have yours, now would be the time to reinstall it. All right, now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our fender liner. We're going to start with the back portion / top half, and then we'll key in the bottom half of the front here. So let's go ahead and do that now. But if you haven't already, make sure you reinstall your plug for one of the bolts on the engine mounts. So let's go ahead and feed that back in. And now we can feed the liner in. We have about 12 T25s, a couple T20s on the mud flap, some that are under here. So let's get to it. As you can see, we opted to keep the foam out, or at least Pat did. We cleaned this. A lot of this is just seam sealer or body wax, but we got all the dirt and debris that was in here, all the grime, as best as we could. Pat's gonna have to come back here and do the other side as well, so he can do both at once, but feel good about stopping future rust. So for now, I'm just gonna feed one T25 up top here to hold the liner in place. So we're gonna have to hold it up and juggle it around. And then we'll line up the bottom corner here. We'll also line up our mud flap, something like that. We'll get 2 20s for the side of the mud flap here. Oh, back at the mud flap, don't forget to reinstall the clip if you still have the mud flap equipped on your car, or if you have one equipped. Make sure that the mud flap is seated all the way back on the fender. We're gonna go ahead and feed this bottom half in before we attach any hardware on the front side of things over here. We'll get these 2 over here started, just to kind of hold everything in place. I'm just gonna leave these loose for now until we get some of the top hardware started as well. Now we have our fender liner installed, we can reinstall our wheel while we have this at our eye level. So let's go ahead and do that now. Make sure you start your lug bolts by hand. The last thing you want to do is cross thread these, especially after a big job, and not be able to test drive your car. And for now, we're just going to snug them up with the impact. Before we set the car back down on the ground, we're going to reinstall our splash shield. And once the car's on the ground, we'll finalize the torque value for the 5 lug bolts. Again, 17mm socket. This is just to snug it up against the hub. All right, before we lower the car down, let's take advantage of the height and reinstall our splash shield once more. All right, now at this point, we can go ahead and reinstall our splash shield. Make sure that the front keys in properly. You have 1 tab that should be down below for one of the T25s. And we'll start with the T30s in the back first so that it can hold up our shield. Then we can work our way around with the T25s. Now our car is missing a few of the T25s, so we'll make sure to install the ones we have by hand. All right, now that we have our splash shield back on, we can lower the car back on the ground, torque up our wheel and then reinstall all the surrounding bits by our engine mounts. So let's do that now. We're gonna go ahead and torque these bolts down in a crisscross pattern to 90 foot-pounds or 120 Newton meters. We can go ahead and reinstall our beauty covers over the lug bolts if you still have those. And now with this situated, let's head back up top and reinstall our upper timing cover. Now we're gonna go ahead and install our upper timing cover. Make sure everything looks like it's lining up properly. We have 2 tabs up top, 1 at the bottom down here, right above the engine mount. All right, now with that, my good people, we're gonna work on swinging our expansion tank back in. Remember, this harness sits over the tank. You might have to play with these lines a little bit. Make sure your coolant lines don't get pinched above the engine mount here, that they run over to the side of it. This is probably the most annoying part of this job, honestly. Just getting this spaghetti back in order. We have 2 T25s back here that hold this tank in place. Let's get those situated. And we'll just use our T25 to get this started. We don't have to snug it down just yet. We just don't want it falling. Now we can go ahead and get the other one situated. Use a magnet tool once more. And we'll get this other one started and then we can snug it down. Beautiful. Now we have our tank in place, we can work on installing our auxiliary pump. There is a small plastic tab that keys onto this flat on the fuel filter housing. So we can situate that one after the fact. We also can go ahead and reinstall the electrical plug that goes to the pump back here. There we go. Now let's grab our 2 M10s and get those situated in place. At this point, we can install the plastic clip that sits on the small tab here that holds these 3 lines in place. This just slides onto the tab, like so. We can pop those lines in. We have the 1 plastic tab on the side here that clips onto our fuel filter bracket. This one's a little bit tricky to see. It's kind of tight. It really only goes on one way. Here we go. It's just kind of press fit. We can just situate the fuel filter. The stud on the front of the engine mount, the bolt that has the stud coming out of it, that keys in one of the tabs for the fuel filter housing. Just like that. And we have 2 10mm bolts and the 1 10mm nut down below that holds this in place. I'm going to use a magnet tool just to fish the hardware into place. Same thing, try to get 1 or 2 threads started. We can also reinstall our mounted body bracket now as well. My good people, I totally made a boo-boo. Should have installed this bracket before we situated the tank down. I'm just gonna zap out the 2 T25s. Don't do as I do as I say. Install the bracket before the 2 T25s that hold your tank down. We're gonna torque these mount to body bracket 13s down to 20 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. So there's our 20. We'll do a quarter turn. We can tuck our wiring loom back onto the expansion tank. We can also clip our level sensor back on if we'd like. We have our neck for our windshield washer fluid. We can go ahead and pop this back in. We have 2 more 10mm bolts up top. We'll hold our bracket to our auxiliary pump. Then we have a T30 to situate up top here. We can feed our bracket back over. This is here to allow the bracket to key on, slide back. Now this one had a little bit of Loctite on it. We might as well go ahead and apply a little bit more since this came off. Now with that, my good people, we have 2 things left to do. We're gonna throw our cover back on. And with that, we'll get our coolant and we'll get our vacuum fill tool and we'll get ready to fill this up with coolant. All right, so at this point, my good people, like we said, we're gonna be using the vacuum fill tool to fill our coolant. Otherwise, you can just fill the reservoir, run the car, heat on high, and let it self-bleed as you top it off. We have our airline set up with our compressor. I've done this with a regular 20-gallon compressor at home, works great. We have shop air today. If you haven't seen us use this tool before, our goal is to pull vacuum up until the 25 mark on the gauge. Give it a few minutes. As long as that gauge does not move, then we know that we have no leaks in the system, and then we can go ahead and fill our vehicle with coolant. This end has to stay at the very bottom of our coolant bucket the whole time. If it sees any air, then this whole process is null. So keep this submerged at all times. If you need to close the valve to add more coolant to the system, go ahead and do that. We have 2 gallons in our bucket, so we should have more than enough. Now, be mindful of your paint. Pat told me he hates the paint on this car, so we're not too worried about scratching the front bumper here. But if you have a car with nice paint, just be very careful. All right, now we're going to pull vacuum. It's completely normal if you can see them to see the coolant lines collapse on your vehicle. So don't be alarmed. That is exactly what you want to see. Right now we're at the 25 on our gauge. We're going to give it a few minutes. We'll come back in a sec, and then we'll fill it with some coolant. All right, it's been a few minutes. We have our hose submerged at the very bottom of our coolant tank. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to open the valve for a sec and prime the system. I'm going to close it back up. And this is a little bit overkill at this point, but I'm just going to pull a little bit more vacuum to account for what was in the line here. And now we can go ahead and open the valve, keep an eye on our coolant level, and wait until it completely stops pulling coolant. Right at this point, our system is done doing its magic trick. You can go ahead and lose the airline. If you need to, go ahead and adjust the level on your expansion tank, either by pulling out some or adding some, but usually the tool leaves it at a pretty good spot. For now, my good people, all we have left to do today is put this cap back on. Now with our coolant filled, my good people, that is going to complete this timing belt and water pump DIY. Overall, not a terrible job. I would argue the hardest part was stretching over the new belt, which is nice and tight compared to the old one, which has stretched over time. That was probably the toughest part of this job. A second set of hands never hurts. If you like this DIY, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave that in the comment section below. And if there's any other job you want to see us do specifically on this Mk6, keep those comments to yourself. I joke. Put those in the comment section below. And if you want to see more DIYs like this, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.